Over the course of his last three movies, Robert Eggers has proven himself to be one of the most interesting up-and-coming voices in the world of film. First, he gave us The Witch, which is a deeply atmospheric and disturbing horror film that, in my opinion, was one of the finest entries into horror from the 2010s. Next, he made The Lighthouse, which is a marked step down for sure, but is still a pretty solid little black and white horror film. Then following that, he gave us The Northman, which once again is a slight step down in my opinion, but is still a pretty solid little Viking film that showcases Robert Eggers' talent for bringing to life historical time periods. So Eggers is a master of visual style, atmosphere, and period pieces. In other words, he's literally the perfect candidate to make a Nosferatu movie. Nosferatu, of course, is a very long-running franchise with surprisingly few entries. It began with 1922's Nosferatu, which is one of the oldest surviving horror films, and it survived for good reason, even though it had many attempts to destroy it since it was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's steeped in the haunting imagery of German Expressionism with creepy Gothic architecture and an unforgettable vampire design. Since then, there have been other films that have taken on the character, but the only really notable one is the 1979 film Nosferatu the Vampire, which just might be the greatest Dracula adaptation of all time. It's truly a stunningly hypnotic work of art. But now, 100 years after that original, we're getting this Robert Eggers version. And spoiler alert, it doesn't quite live up to the 79 version, which for me is still the gold standard, but it is still very much a film that stands on its own feet. And so I guess I might as well just get into talking about it, starting with the bad. And I don't really have anything to talk about in this category, so I guess we might as well move on to the mixed. There are a few things I want to mention here. For starters, I don't like how loud the score is. Like, I don't need a loud, bombastic score to tell me that it's a bad thing when Dracula is slowly approaching someone. And I don't need a sudden loud jump scare sound to tell me when Dracula is coming out of the shadows or something. The volume of the musical cues is just a bit too much at times, and it kind of takes me out of it. I also think the movie runs a bit long. There are some quite decent length stretches where the film is just struggling to hold my interest. And by the time we get to the end, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't feeling a bit exhausted. And finally, I don't love the Nosferatu design in this one as much as I was hoping. Bill Skarsgård is unrecognizable under some prosthetics that look pretty good. This Dracula isn't someone I would want to run into in a dark alley by any means, but he lacks the striking appearance of the original or the 1979 version. And because he's so ugly, he also lacks the appeal of something like the Bela Lugosi iteration, which leaves him just kind of in this strange middle ground where he's not a terrible design, but I just don't think I'm going to remember this one as much. It's not going to stick with me. But with that said, let's move on to the good. I think the single most admirable aspect of this film is just how completely it swallows you in this time period from the 1800s. The sets, the costumes, the language, the hairstyles, everything is just steeped in the period. I've loved and been impressed by the kind of overblown Gothic aesthetics of previous adaptations, but this one I think is impressive for a different reason because I'm just in awe of how raw and realistic it all feels. It feels like Robert Eggers and his crew went back to this time period and shot there. This is his specialty, and he definitely does not disappoint in this department. With his previous movies, like The Witch and The Lighthouse, practically every shot in those movies was just an atmospheric visual feast for the eyes. This movie isn't quite on that level, but it still has some shots that manage to take my breath away. There's like the scene where the carriage is rolling up to Dracula's castle and we get this big long view of this whole valley and everything. And, that shot is just truly incredible, and there's plenty of others in the film like it. I also want to compliment the performers here. The casting was just perfect. You've got
Nicholas Hoult
plays this Thomas Hutter character, and he does quite a good job in that role. Lily Rose Depp somehow manages to make her lines, which often border into the territory of excess, feel pretty believable, or as believable as they're going to be. Alexander Skarsgård is an intimidating force under all that makeup, and the great Willem Dafoe shows up as the Van Helsing character and brings some really great energy to that role. Overall, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is a very solid Bram Stoker adaptation. I don't love every choice here, but I do love some. And while this isn't the best adaptation I've ever seen, it's also far from the worst. So, in my opinion, it's a 7 out of 10.